Well, it's always risky at a conference to talk about the work of somebody who's sitting in the audience. It's doubly risky when that person has been literally given the last word by summing up the event. But that being said, I'd like to begin this paper on the merits of patriotism by engaging with Professor Nigel Biggar's essay, The Value of Limited Loyalty, Christianity, the Nation, and Territorial Boundaries, which appeared in the 2001 book, Boundaries and Justice. So one of the reasons why I was interested in this subject, but also in Professor Biggar's book about immigrants, is that I am one, as you can tell from my accent. In some ways, I was interested, what does he think of me? I'm a classic example of a Canadian, a foreigner, who came over here, took your jobs, married an English girl, so I stole your women. What does Nigel Biggar think of me? One of Professor Biggar's aims in his essay is to provide an account of what he thinks Christians should say about nations and national loyalty, and to trace their implications for territorial boundaries. In his conclusion, Professor Biggar sums up his argument, and I'm quoting, "This essay has brought Christian thinking to bear upon the nature and purposes of territorial boundaries primarily through the concept of human being as creaturely. According to this concept, each human individual is born into, brought up in, and given a grip on life by a particular set of communities, which nowadays almost invariably includes one of a diversity of nations. His essay argues that as we benefit from our nation, we owe it a certain loyalty, including a support for a sensible policy of border control and protection." I think that the material on immigration and border protection is interesting. I think it's insightful. However, in this paper today, I don't want to comment so much on that aspect, about the movements of people and immigration, as much as I want to talk about Professor Biggar's thesis that Christian ethics are rooted in the concept of human being as creaturely, and in the way that this underwrites a view of nationhood and patriotic loyalty. Throughout his essay, the main sparring partner appears in the guise of the cosmopolitan. Such a position is articulated, for example, by Richard Miller, who also appears in the Boundaries book. And Miller argues, quote, "Christianity requires an indiscriminate, unconditional love of others, irrespective of political, social, or national affiliation. Christian agape, exemplified by Jesus' teaching and example, is altruistic and cosmopolitan." Instead, drawing from the likes of Barth and Bonhoeffer, Biggar pits the cosmopolitan against the creaturely. If we take seriously the fact that human identity is rooted in time and space, then all human interaction must also be thus rooted, rendering the cosmopolitan ideal of a borderless brotherhood of man not only utopian, but also dangerously inhuman. Professor Biggar's critique against cosmopolitanism is deeply theological. The affirmation of the creaturely human being, he writes, is also implicit in the orthodox Christian doctrine of the divine incarnation, according to which God Almighty became human in Jesus of Nazareth, and in becoming human became historical. That is, a particular man living in a particular time and place. According to the Christian story, it is characteristic of God to be willing to meet human creatures in the midst of their historicality and diversity. It is the national communities that sustain and nurture historically diverse humanity. And so, Professor Biggar thinks, it is to the nation which Christians should affirm their special loyalty. This is a good essay, and I commend it to you. I like his emphasis on the theological touchstones of incarnation, spirit, and Trinity, as forging a Christian social ethic that is genuine, workable, and humane. I also like Professor Biggar's critique of cosmopolitanism. This may come as a surprise to him, for he intimates in his essay that the two options open to a citizen are either patriotism or cosmopolitanism, and I am not a patriot. I wish to argue that the kind of loyalty understood as patriotism is ultimately incompatible with, or perhaps at least eternally subverted, by Christian ethics. However, I think this for the same sorts of reasons that Professor Biggar rejects cosmopolitanism. In short, I suggest that both patriotism and cosmopolitanism tend towards abstraction away from the real people who are properly the focus of any creaturely, incarnational Christian social ethic. However, before going further, we need to look at the name that comes up again and again in discussions of theology and patriotism. Behind Professor Bigger's emphasis on the creaturely lies Dietrich Bonhoeffer's concern for reality. Reality for Bonhoeffer is the totality of God's creation affirmed by the Incarnation. In the Ethics, he says, Christ himself entered into the natural life. The natural is the form of life preserved by God and through its preservation directed towards Christ. It is the form which embraces the entire human race. Christ exists for all people, and therefore he exists for all that goes into establishing the existence and identity of those people. To love this reality is to love the orders of preservation and purpose that God has put into place for human flourishing. So goes the argument. The core of Bonhoeffer's conception of reality is formed by phenomena common to patriotism. Bonhoeffer places high value on the part that land, heritage, and inherited tradition plays in forming the contextual reality in which human life takes place. These objects of patriotic affection were, for Bonhoeffer, essential components of real life that were not to be transcended by the Christian. Writing to a pastor friend who had been called up to join the army, Bonhoeffer reminds him of the traditions, education, law, and German church culture that the young man was fighting for, concluding that participating in the fellowship of one's people is, quote, the way of God with one's life, and it is quite firm ground on which to stand and get through difficulties. In ethics, one's cultural heritage cannot be brushed aside easily, for in terms of contributing to human existence, it is real and concrete. Says Bonhoeffer, by our history, we are set objectively in a definite nexus of experiences, responsibilities, and decisions, from which we cannot free ourselves again, except by an abstraction. Note that Bonhoeffer, too, recruits patriotism in his fight against abstraction. The line drawn in the sand is the line drawn between allegiance to the real and particular on one hand, and what is conceptual and intangible on the other. For Bonhoeffer, patriotism was a positive force, distinct from nationalism. Following the commentator Keith Clements, we can define patriotism in the Bonhoefferian sense as an awareness and love for the reality of one's national and cultural heritage. By contrast, in the Ethics, nationalism appears as a sickly perversion of healthy patriotism. It is patriotism's shadow, aping true love for one's culture and God's order with an idolatrous predilection for inventing false cultural identities and setting them against one another, resulting only in chaos. Bonhoeffer dislikes the romantic notions of nationhood that see it as a groundswell of the people. To do so is to base the nation on a false assumption about the created order of mankind, as if tribalism is the source of order and creation rather than the divine. Inevitably, this distortion results in the kind of fracturing that can only happen when people groups rally around what makes them different from each other rather than united around a common purpose. Thus, for Bonhoeffer, nationalism substitutes a pseudo-unity for the real thing. Bonhoeffer contrasts nationalism's love of man-made concepts with patriotic allegiance to the created order. In his essay, Professor Bigger also effectively differentiates between the vice of nationalism and the virtue of patriotism. Nationalism names a false idol of self-serving myth, while patriotism names something true about the society and culture of human creatures. Bigger steers away from, quote, national myths of racial or ethnic or cultural purity, calling them immediately suspect. In their stead, he promotes a certain kind of national loyalty in terms of the Christian concept of the creatureliness of human being. They are not alone in taking this course. In the literature, it is often assumed, and occasionally made explicit, that patriotism, as opposed to nationalism, applies to real people in concrete situations. So it is that Hegel can praise patriotism as the political disposition which is certainly based on truth, whereas merely subjective certainty does not originate in truth, but is only opinion. Eli Kedgeray thinks that it is relatively easy to distinguish patriotic affection for one's country or group from the anthropology and doctrine implied by nationalism. Jürgen Habermas compares the reasonable loyalty of patriotic citizens with the irrational focus on cultural ethnicity that manifests in nationalism. Similarly, Alistair MacIntyre defends patriotism based on a country's, quote, true history over and against the irrational attitude of pledging allegiance towards those nations which have built themselves on largely fictitious narratives. Yet the belief in the truth of patriotism, or the assumption that there can be any nation whose narrative is not largely fictitious, begs precisely the question at hand. Nations are notoriously difficult to define. Purely racial descriptors do not work. So if, for example, the French and the Germans share the same race, but are different nations, as are Rwandan Hutus and Tutsis. This last example highlights how political designations are even worse. The state of Rwanda is home to numerous national groups. Ask the Basques whether they are Spanish just because they have a Spanish passport. Although the terms are commonly used interchangeably, states are not nations. Indeed, every country on earth is a state hosting a multitude of nations. As an obvious example, the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish, and the English are different nations living in the same state. Furthermore, each of these national identities are themselves divisible into other identifiable cultures, which has already come up in the questions earlier. The indigenous population of Northern Ireland may share the same ethnicity, but they are hardly one nation. Although they are both English, a Yorkshireman is not a Cornishman, Shetlanders don't say that they are Scottish, and so on and so on. Whatever a nation is, it seems also to be endlessly indefinable and divisible. While one can find affinities with tribal, feudal, or other historical iterations of organized societies, the nation proper is a relatively recent phenomenon. Nations, as we know them today, are an early modern invention with roots in revolutionary Europe. The English word nationalism has been traced back to occasional use in the literature from 1798, but it did not appear in lexicographies until the late 19th century. During the Great War of 1914 to 1918, men fought in the name of nations that their grandparents had never heard of. Our conception of the nation is relatively new and in constant flux, its contours continuing to shift while ever newer nations spring up. National identities are constantly developing narratives, not simply legal, geographic, or biological givens. Nations are made up. It is thus that Benedict Anderson can famously say of the nation that it is an imagined community. Now, the question is not whether nations are real, but rather in what way they exist. Nations and nationalisms are real and powerful sociological phenomena, even if their reality is quite different from the tale told about them by nationalists themselves. The task of theological commentators is to deal with the nation for what it is. Nations are not prehistoric, natural features of human life, and the contours of nationalism are not primarily structured along biological, linguistic, legalistic, or geographic lines. Nations are not locations. They are not persons. They are not families. They are not communities. Indeed, if we were to think of nations in terms of an analogous subject at all, we'd go less wrong less often if we thought of them in terms of stories or ideas. It is problematic then when commentators try to base their patriotism on something true about a particular human culture while rejecting what is self-serving or invented about the nation. It is even more of a problem when patriotism is conducted under the banner of concern for real people and a creaturely concrete and incarnational ethic. Even if patriotism is not overtly focused on race or ethnicity, it is still focused on things that are the result of selective historical memory. And any act of selection involves multiple deselection of elements that do not fit the preferred patriotic picture. By telling you who you are and what you should love, patriotic narratives make overarching and abstract identity claims. The claim that patriotism is an abstract social doctrine is counterintuitive. Nation language holds out the promise of tangible ways to talk about personal identity and group destiny. It offers the promise of social cohesion and stability. Nothing is more obvious or essential or common sense than one's national identity, runs the logic. Therefore, this is a prime base for looking at the world and our collective role in it. Yet people's identities are made up of many strands. A person's national identity is only part of who they are. Usually in day-to-day life, it is not even the most important part. Citizens of modern societies have many important factors contributing to their identity that are not exhausted by the national. A Scot can also be an atheist, a woman, an old-age pensioner, and black. A white Englishman might also be a heterosexual, a father, a feminist, a wheelchair user, and so on. At any one time, any one of these strands may well be more important than the other when it comes to their personhood. As Amartya Sen argues in his book Identity and Violence, given our inescapably plural identities, we have to decide on the relative importance of our different associations and affiliations in any particular context. We only do ourselves a disservice when we assume that the national strand is the most important aspect and coordinate our outlook accordingly, by reducing what is most important about a person to one and only one group that they might belong to. Rather than operating in the abstract, Christians would do well to engage with people as they really are. This includes the ever-changing complexity of what it means to be a human being. Fortunately, Christians have a word for describing a person in such a way that their individuality is preserved in all its elements, without reducing their identity to any one element, and without reference to any groups that they might belong to. And that word is neighbour. If the Christian duty is to love, then there must be a target of that love, and a better or worse way of identifying that target, as the young lawyer who asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbour?" knew full well. There is a tension underlying the duty of love, and that is the determination of who or what constitutes the locus of our responsibility. Is it those who share the same formational culture, the formational culture itself, or a person whose definition transcends these socialized models? If a person must be properly socialized, to use Merrill Westphal's phrase, in order to be considered a person, then in effect only those who share one's social nexus are persons when it comes to identifying the targets of ethical duty. But if there is something above and beyond shared preference that make a person, then that has implications for who and how we should love. But isn't this just cosmopolitanism? Here it is useful to draw from the thought of Søren Kierkegaard and his book Works of Love. The book is an extended reflection on the category of neighbour, which stands in stark contrast to the co-national when it comes to the shaping of one's ethical duty. Works of Love identifies and contrasts two loves, the love of passionate preference and neighbour love. Preferential love seeks only those who share one's passions. The more similar the lovers, the better the love. This encompasses not only erotic affection, but also patriotism. By contrast with neighbour love, there is no question of loving for sameness' sake. It thrives in a situation of difference, able to include many people under its aegis. The trajectory of love based on passionate preference is always towards the one and only one beloved. The trajectory of neighbour love is towards the opposite direction. On the surface, it seems that focusing love on a bounded, limited target is better than dissipating love willy-nilly. Yet it soon becomes apparent that the one person of passionate preference is not really even another individual. Here Kierkegaard makes the connection between preferential love and pathological self-love. Could it be that the passionate lover himself is the real target of the preference? In short, if preferential love is love for those who look like me and sound like me, then the ultimate horizon for such love is me. This suggests, Kierkegaard, marks the very peak of self-esteem, the I intoxicated in the other I. As we have seen, a common charge levelled against critics of patriotism is that to move away from preferring the nation is to move away from concrete reality and towards a vague sentiment which is utopian, unworkable, and ultimately inhuman. I think the opposite is true. I posit neighbour love precisely because it is realistic, creaturely, and local. Misgivings about passionate preference arise not because it is focused on the stuff of this life, but because it excludes so many people, withdrawing into tighter and tighter circles of sameness, and thus abstraction away from reality. Neighbour love has a further advantage over preferential love, in that the identification of the subject to be loved is infinitely simpler. The love of preference, as with national or patriotic affiliation, needs to draw up endless distinctions and exclusions in order to attain the purest expression of its passion. Libraries and academic conferences such as this one devote a lot of time and space to the subject of defining national identity and patriotic allegiance. There is no similar space devoted to the neighbour. This is because her identification is not in question. Kierkegaard remarks that when one is searching for one's neighbour, all one needs to do is open the door and go out. The very first person you meet is the neighbour, whom you shall love. There is not a single person in the whole world who is as surely and as easily recognised as the neighbour. Kierkegaard's neighbour is a cipher for other individuals, the I, whose existence can be affirmed without reference to oneself and without making an appeal to the slippery notion of the nation. I want to highlight here how it is that the neighbour is an alternative Christian category that undermines the confidence normally placed in the commonsensical category of the compatriot. As a way of describing the recipient or target of our love, the neighbour competes with and subverts the compatriot. Neighbours are real and concrete in a way that a person identified primarily along national lines can never be. It is nations and not neighbourhoods which are imagined communities. The patriot who too closely identifies himself and his fellows with a national construct is grasping at abstractions that remove or distract him from interacting with the real people around him, including his compatriots. In this light, Kierkegaard's warning is apt. When it is a duty to love the people we see, one must first and foremost give up all imaginary and exaggerated ideas about a dream world where the object of love should be sought and found. That is, one must become sober, gain actuality and truth by finding and remaining in the world of actuality as the task assigned to one. With regard to loving, the most dangerous of all escapes is wanting to love only the unseen or that which one has not seen. This is not to say that neighbours rescind their respective national identities, only that the total of their identity as persons is not summed up by their national story. Or to put it another way, in the real societies in which we live, the individuals around us may or may not be our compatriots, but they will always be our neighbours, like me. I don't think any of your nationalities, but you have to love me anyway. The Christian does not have an ethical duty only towards people whose national narratives dovetail with their own. The duty is to love the neighbour simply because they are the neighbour. Arguably, only that which looks outward and engages with other persons, regardless of their similarity to us, can properly be deemed love. A social life based on infatuation for the group is far less useful to members of that society than one based on practical regard for others. And here I suppose Max, Wind, Cowie and I could have a discussion. True sociality cannot be based on affection for the nation, trumped up and maintained by self-serving fictions. It must be directed instead at the existing subject in the here and now. As Kierkegaard says, love for neighbour does not want to be sung about, it wants to be accomplished. To repeat Professor Bigger, the affirmation of the creaturely human being is implicit in the orthodox Christian doctrine of the divine incarnation, according to which God Almighty became human in Jesus of Nazareth, and in becoming human became historical. That is, a particular man living in a particular time and place. To this I can only agree, and suggest to him and to other Christian patriots that the particular time and place which attracts the Christian incarnational ethic is best served not by making primary reference to the abstract and unstable idea of nationhood, but instead to the tangible and local reality of the neighbourhood. I might be wrong, but thank you for listening.